All right. Good morning, everybody, and a big welcome back to Mark, who's rejoining us from Washington, D.C. So we are beginning on Chaf Aleph. That is recorded. Yeah. We are beginning Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. We are 3 lines from the bottom. We are about to begin the sugya of the Atzat Nakov. So why are we even talking about the Atzat Nakov? So the Mishnah talked about the halacha that we learned about yesterday, which is that a get needs to be written on something that is not mechuber lakarka, right? It needs to be detached from the ground. And every time you have a sugya that deals with things that are mechuber lakarka, this atzutz nakov tends to come up. So the atzutz nakov is a perforated flower pot. So it's some sort of flower pot, which is in theory metalloplan. It is not connected to the ground. You can pick it up, you can move it, but there's holes, it's perforated, and therefore the stuff that's growing inside the pot in some level is being nourished from the ground. It's being yonik from the ground. And therefore, this perforated flower pot, the atzutz nakov, kind of has qualities both as a metalloplan and also as something that's, mechuber lakarka. So it's going to come up in this sugya. So again, starting 3 lines from the bottom, the first wide line, end of the line, pasvu. So the Gemara says, pasvu al cheres shel atzutz nakov. Let's say you write a get on the pot itself, on the pottery part of the perforated flower pot. So kasher, that is a kasher get. The shakale v'yayiv le'nele, because you can just pick it up and you can give it to her. So you don't have to detach anything. It's already detached from the ground. You can just pick it up, you can give it to her, and therefore you can write a get on the flower pot. But what about al Allah shel atzutz nakov? Let's say you write it on one of the leaves that's growing out of the flower pot. So Abaya Amar Kasher, Rava Amar Pasul. Now we have a machlokas Abaya and Rava. Abaya Amar Kasher. Abaya said that it's okay. Same sort. It's not connected to the ground. Just because it's written on a leaf, you can still pick up the flower pot and you can give the flower pot to the woman, and therefore, b'nasan b'yadav. And there's no, it's not mechuber to the ground. Rava disagrees. Rava Amar Pasul. Gzeira Shema Yaakov. Because of the fact that these leaves are being nourished from the ground, there's at least some sort of gzeira that maybe you will cut the leaf before giving it to her. And again, because it's mechuber lakarka, it's being nourished from the ground, therefore this would be considered a katzitza. And we said yesterday, v'kasav v'nasan, you need to write a get and give it to her. It can't be v'kasav v'katzatz v'nasan. And therefore Rav is concerned that at least when it comes to a perforated flower pot, there's enough nourishment from the ground that this halacha would apply. Whatever it's worth, Tosfos on this long Tosfos on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, the second one, makes a diak, and he says, we see from Rava, he's only concerned about the perforated flower pot. What if you had an actual flower pot that wasn't perforated and you had leaves that were growing out? He wouldn't be concerned that you would cut the leaves. So it sounds like this whole issue of cutting something is dafka when it's mechuber to the ground. But if something's not mechuber to the ground, maybe you can write a get and cut it. And the big nafkamina would be, apparently this was a massive controversy in the times of Tosfos, but he talks about a case where a sofer wrote a get on parchment and then realized that the parchment was very big and he wanted to cut the piece of parchment to save the rest of the parchment. Does that get into this halacha of, is that considered cutting or is that not considered cutting? Again, massive controversy that is dealt with in this Tosfos on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. But either way, moving along. So now that we're on the topic of the atzutz nakov, we are going to digress a little bit and talk about other halachas that have to do with an atzutz nakov. So first, we're going to talk about the halachas of how you make a kinyan. So as a general matter, when you're dealing with karka or nechasim sheyesh lahem aprayis in the vernacular, the way to make a kinyan is kesef, shtar, or chazaka. So you have to, focusing on chazaka for a second, you have to better the ground in some fashion, right? That's how you make a kinyan on karka. As opposed to metaltalin, you can't do beer with land. Yeah, exactly. What? Well, you can try, maybe that's a chazaka, but the point is, as a general matter, you have to do a chazaka. So you have to dig of some sort, show ownership of some sort. But that's to be contrasted with metaltalin. So if you have metaltalin, right, you don't make a chazaka, rather you do some sort of meshicha, you do some sort of hagbah. So again, the question is going to be, when you have a flower pot that's metaltalin, but it's a perforated flower pot, and therefore the stuff that's growing in is kind of mechuber to the ground, how do you make the kinyan on something like this? So the Gemara says like this, atzitz, we're on the second line from the top, atzitz shal echad, let's say the flower pot belongs to one person, who's ra'im shal acher. So they're partners. One guy owns the pot, the other guy owns the seeds inside the pot. So now Macher Bal Atzitz Labal Zraim. Let's say the guy who owns the pot wants to sell the pot to the guy who owns the seeds. So Kevin Shemashach Kana. All the seed owner needs to do is do a Mashiach on the pot. The pot is clearly metalphalin, and therefore you can effectuate a kinyan on the pot just by doing a Mashiach. But the other way around, a Mashiach wouldn't work. So Macher Bal Zraim Libal Atzitz. Let's say the guy who owns the seeds wants to sell his seeds to the guy who owns the pot. Lo kana achi yachzik bizraim. You can't just do a mashicha on the pot. You have to do some sort of chazaka on the soil in the pot. Let's just assume this is a very large flower pot. I mean, it's probably not a little thing sitting on your thing, right? It's some sort of large pot that's on the ground. So you got to do some sort of chazaka on the seed themselves, and that's how you can be kona this right. But just doing a mashicha or a hagba on the pot wouldn't work. All right, what about a third case? Atzitz uzraim shel echad. Let's say one person owns the whole thing here. One person owns the pot, he owns the seeds, and he wants to sell the whole thing to a third guy. How does the third guy make a kinyan? So the halacha is hechzik bizraim. If you do a chazaka on the seeds, this third guy, kana atzitz, by doing the chazaka on the seeds, you can also acquire the flower pot itself. The zuhi sheshaninu, and this is what's known in the vernacular as a kinyan agav. But the Gemara says, Zohi sheshaninu nechasim she'ein lahem achrayis niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayis b'kesef shtar uba chazaka. So there's a concept, what's known as a kinyan agav, that when a person is kona karka, right? If you do a proper kinyan on the karka, you can even be kona metalpin. So for example, if you buy a house, you can acquire a bicycle, right? Whether it's on the property or if it's not on the property. You can put in the contract, whatever, by selling you this house, by doing this kinyan, you can also acquire my metalphalin that's somewhere else. But it doesn't work in the other direction. If I acquire metalphalin, I can't acquire the karka. So the point is, if I own the flower pot and the seeds, and I want to sell to a third person, I want to sell to another person, that person can do a chazaka on the seeds, which is considered karka. I can do a chazaka. And he can, via that chazaka, he can acquire even the pot. But the other direction wouldn't work. So the Gemara says, but what if this buyer does a chazaka on the flower pot? And we said, you can't do a chazaka on metalphalin. So I don't know what even the facts could be. I don't know what type of chazaka you would do. But if you tried to do a chazaka on the metalphalin aspect of this, not only do you not acquire the seeds, because kinyan agav only works one direction, not the other. But you're not even going to be kona the flower pot itself, because again, in order to acquire metalphalin, you need to do a hadba or a mashicha, not a chazaka. So if this guy tries to do a chazaka on the flower pot, not only will he not acquire the seeds, he's also not even going to acquire the flower pot. So this was all a very long way of saying the way you acquire metalphalin is different than the way you acquire karka. This atzitz nakov, this perforated flower pot, has qualities of metalphalin. It also has qualities of karka because it's seeds inside a pot, and the seeds are being yonik from the ground. So you just have to play with these rules a little bit to understand if one guy is selling to the other guy, what's the proper way of doing the kinyan? And if you're selling the whole thing, you can't acquire the entire thing with one move, but you got to do a chazaka on the karka, and agav, that kinyan, you'll acquire the metalphalin, but it doesn't work the other direction. You can't acquire the metalphalin, and agav, the metalphalin, acquire the karka. That's
I believe that when we sell
what? We're saying the halachas in the context of an atzitz nakov because it's this quasi thing that it includes metalphalin.
Gets from the ground. It's got to be cold in order to get that.
Yeah, so if this was an atzitz she'eino nakov, then the whole thing would be metalphalin. I don't think any part of this would be karka. Yeah, exactly. So now we are moving from one set of technical halachas to another set of technical halachas, and this is going to be, what if our atzitz nakov happens to be planted right on the border of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, right? Do they talk about this at APEC, by the way? Trumas and Meisters of an atzitz nakov right on the border. They did talk about the borders. All right, good enough. So we're going to go into a discussion of Trumas and Meisters, how all this works. If our pot happens to be located right on the border. So again, we are 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, about 10 lines from the top. First word on the line is nakvu. So nakvu ba'aretz. Let's say the whole of the flower pot is situated in Eretz Yisrael. V'nofo b'chutz la'aretz. But the vegetation, that's whatever's growing of the flower pot is in chutz la'aretz. It's over the border. And the question is, there's vegetables, there's fruit. Let's go with fruit because I think that's high on a Dioraisa level. There's fruit growing on this thing, and the fruit's growing into Chutz La'aretz. And the question is it Chayiv Trumas and Meisers or is it not Chayiv Trumas and Meisers? Again, the whole is over Eretz Yisrael. So to the extent there's being any nourishment from the ground in the Yanuka, it's going to be from Eretz Yisrael. But then again, all the vegetation is over the line. Yeah, in
With the tree.
we're gonna get there. Yeah, so that's one of the raya that the Gemara is gonna bring. But again, just don't put your flower pot there. You won't have these problems. But
Just move it over.
in theory, right, you would think, but that we wouldn't have a day's daf yomi. We just did that. So you know, the writers are on strike. I get it, but like, we need to either way. So Abaya Amar Basar Nukvo is Lina. Abaya says you focus on where the hole is, and therefore the nourishment's being done in Eretz Yisrael. Everything's Chayiv Trumas and Meisers. Rava Amar Basar Nofo is Rava argues, and he says no. We look at where the vegetation is, in the airspace of it. It's in Chutz La'aretz, so it's not Chayiv and Trumas and Meisers. And the Gemara says Bida Ashrosh Kuliyam Lo Pligi. If the vegetation had taken root inside Eretz Yisrael, so for example, if you couldn't lift up the flower pot because it had taken root in Eretz Yisrael, so then Kuliyam Lo Pligi. Then of course everyone would agree that it's all Chayiv and Trumas and Meisers, regardless of where the vegetation actually exists. He pligi below ashers. The entire machlukas Abaye and Rava is dafka where it hasn't taken root, so it's just on some levels being nourished from the ground, but it hasn't actually taken root in Eretz Yisrael. And that's the machlokas Abaye and Rava. Do you focus on where the hole is, or do you focus where the vegetation is sitting in the airspace of? But the Gemara has a problem with this. The Gemara says, "Ubeda ashers lo pligi." Is that really true? That even where it's taken root, Abaye and Rava, or you couldn't argue about. Do you focus on where it's being nourished from or where it's currently existing? Batzanan, we have a Mishnah. This is at the way end of Baba Mitzia. And this is, again, not in the context of Trumas and Meisros. This is in the context of really more Chush and Mishpat, which is why it's in Baba Mitzia. But the case is like this. Shtei ganos zu al gav zu, v'yerek bein time. So imagine you've got one garden that's on ground level, and you've got another garden right next to it that's elevated. And in between the gardens, there is soil, right? So it's like garden, soil, garden. And both gardens are owned by different people, and there's like wild vegetables that are just growing from the soil in the middle, but all of the vegetation is kind of like in the airspace of the guy who owns the tachton. So clearly, it's being yonik from the soil of the elyon, but it's existing in the airspace of the tachton. This is this case in the end of Bava Mitzia. So again, Shtei ganos zu al gav zu. He says that the produce, these wild vegetation, it belongs to the guy who owns the top garden. Rabbi Yehuda argues, he says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shel Tachton. And again, the Gemara says clearly, everyone's going to agree that it's being nourished from the soil of the top guy, and yet it's in the airspace of the bottom guy. And we have this machlokas. Does it belong to the Tachton or does it belong to the Elyon? But the Gemara says that's not a good comparison because, again, in our case, we're dealing with Trumas and Meisros, we're dealing with a halachic child. That's not a halachic child. That's a Choshen Mishpat child. So the Gemara says Hasam Kediktani time. In that case, I'll tell you that the reason why they have a machlokas is that each landowner kind of has their own, time to their own argument as to why they should be the ones to be able to have ownership of these vegetables. Amr of Meir, who sides with the top guy, he can say, "Ma'am, you're to Elyon Litolas Apro in Kanyerek." The top guy can just unplant all of his stuff, unroot, like dig out all the soil, and there won't be any vegetables over here. So clearly, he's got the upper hand and he's got the ownership on the vegetables. But Rabbi Yehuda responds, and he can say, "Ma'am, you're to Tachton the Malos, so upper." The bottom guy, he can just like build a skyscraper and build all the way up, and then again he'd ruin this vegetation. There wouldn't be any room for this vegetation, so maybe he has the better claim to these vegetables that are growing. But the bottom line is that you can't bring a comparison from this Mishnah of Bava Mitzia because it wasn't dealing with like a halachic shaila of is something that's that takes root in this specific soil. What's the halachic status? Is it Chutz La'aretz? Not Chutz La'aretz? It's really just more who has the better taina to these vegetables from a Choshen Mishpat perspective. So that's not a good comparison. And therefore, just getting back to our original shaila, the Gemara said that the machlokas Abaye Rava, in our case of Atzis Nakuf, it only applies where the soil or hasn't taken root in Eretz Yisrael. If it took root in Eretz Yisrael, everyone would agree. But the Gemara says, really? Really, you're telling me that even where it took root, there can't be a machlokas, whether we go basar, the soil, or basar, where the vegetation is, the ear space. But Tanya, and this is one of the cases that Mark was telling us about, here we have a brisa, we have a tree. Elon, miktsasa ba'aretz and miktsasa b'chutz la'aretz. So now we have not a pot, but an actual tree. And the trunk is located half in Eretz Yisrael and half in chutz la'aretz. Is it chayiv and shumas ma'asros, or is it not chayiv and shumas ma'asros? So tevel b'chulin ravin zebezed diber Rebbe. Rebbe says that whatever grows on this tree, regardless of whether the apples, whether the apples are in Jordan or whether they're in Eretz Yisrael, all of it is going to have some sort of status of ravin zebezed, some sort of suffix, tevel suffix, already mu'usr, and or not subject to meiser, I shouldn't say already mu'usr. Subject tevel, subject not subject to meiser, and Rashi speaks out. It's a whole problem because now it's very hard to even fix the tevel because you can't use produce that's definitely chayiv in tevel, and you can't use produce that's not chayiv in tevel. This is quasi thing, and you're going to have all sorts of problems. So again, don't own a tree that's literally on the border. But Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, he argues with Rabbi, and he says Hagadol b'chiyav chayiv, Hagadol b'tur patur. He focuses on the ear space itself, and he says whatever the apples are currently in Jordan, don't have to worry about Shumas and Meisers. And the apples that are currently in Eretz Yisrael are chayiv vadai on Shumas and Meisers. So clearly here we see that again, we have this machlokas, we have a tree. The tree is clearly yonik, from the ground, from both. And yet Rebbe says it's a suffix, but Rav Shimon Gamliel says it's not a suffix. We just go basar where the fruit is. And the Gemara says, my lav, mixtas nofa ba'aretz and mixtas nofa b'chutz la'aretz. Again, wouldn't you assume that some of the branches are here, some of the branches are there? Rashi speaks out, and the Gemara is assuming that this would even be the halacha. Rav Shimon Gamliel would even say this halacha, even if all of the shrushim are in either Eretz Yisrael or chutz la'aretz, meaning Rav Shimon Gamliel is just not concerned about where the tree takes root. He's only concerned about where the nof is, just like, let's say like
vegetation.
Exactly where the vegetation, where the apples currently are right now. He's not concerned about, where it's being shoresh from the ground. So again, bringing this back to our sugya, just like Rav Shimon Gamliel isn't concerned. Maybe I'll tell you that in our case of the Yatzis Nakaf, I can tell you even where it is rooted in the ground of Eretz Yisrael, still I can have a shita like Rava that says I still care about where the vegetation is, not so much where it's rooted. Just like Rav Shimon Gamliel over here. But the Gemara says, no, it's not muchach that way. Really, I'll tell you, mixas shrushin ba'aretz, mixas shrushin b'chutz la'aretz. Maybe I'll tell you that half of the roots are in Israel, half of the roots are in Jordan. So therefore, the apples that are in Jordan are fully Jordan, and the apples that are in Eretz Yisrael are fully Eretz Yisrael. And that's why Rav Shimon Gamliel says, I don't have any sort of suffix here. The apples that are there have that status, and the apples that are in Eretz Yisrael have that status. So the Gemara says, okay, so bottom line, you might time it, Rav Shimon Gamliel. Like, even if you'll tell me that the roots, half of them are coming this way and half of them are coming this way, but clearly the way Rashi explains, it's with sap, stuff that I totally don't understand. But the point is, clearly, even if roots are going in different directions, the fruit of the tree is being yonik from some sort of combination of both of them, right? The way fruit is produced in a tree, it deals with the sap that's coming. It's just some sort of mixture. So even if you tell me that, yes, there are some roots that go this way, there are some roots that go this way, and there are some fruits that go this way, and fruits that go that way, it's not a clean split. How can you tell me that the fruit that's in Jordan is not subject to Meiser, and the fruits that are in Eretz Yisrael are subject to Meiser? There's got to be some sort of tarubas that's going on over here. It's all within one tree. That's kind of the question. And the Gemara answers with a very, interesting ukimta. The Gemara says, so again, my time to Rav Shimon Gamliel, the mafsik sunma. Because here I'll tell you that there's some sort of rock that's going right under the tree, and there's some sort of separation. So clearly the roots that are on one side of the rock, they're dealing with the fruit that's on that side of the border, and the roots that are on the other side of the rock, they're helping to yonik the fruit that is on the other, the Israel side of the border. And therefore, it's not true. There is no mixture. But the obvious question.
And what he's saying is he's avoiding.
Exactly.
a clear demarcation
Exactly.
between this stuff and that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not gonna explain the science. I don't understand the science, but yes, exactly. But the Gemara is gonna ask the obvious question. If there's this clear distinction, this clear demarcation, so then how do you understand Rebbe? Rebbe says everything's a suffix. Why should it be a suffix? We've got roots that are here, we've got roots that are there, we've got a rock in the middle. So the fruit that's on this side, that should be one status. And the fruits that's on the other side should have another status. So the Gemara says, my time at the Rebbe, the Hadri Arvi. He says, I hear you, the roots go a certain way, but at some point they connect into the tree, and then it's all one tree. And again, there's some sort of taruvis in the way, fruit is developed. There's some sort of mixture. And therefore, I believe that there should be some sort of status. The Gemara says, so bottom line, what exactly is this machlokas? What we're going to see is it's very scientific. Mar Savar Avira Mepalbel. Rebbe says that, again, once it's in the tree, it all kind of gets mixed up. And therefore, the fruit should all have a status of some sort of tarubis. Umar Savar Hailuchudeikai argues, he says, no, as long as there's a clear separation from this rock in the ground, then whatever grows on that side of the border has that status, and whatever grows on that side of the border has that status. But again, this is all some large digression. As we need for us, we don't have a raya ultimately, and maybe you could even say, like the Gemara wanted to say, that in our case of a flower pot that's on the border,
Right.
so long as the hole is on the side of Eretz Yisrael and it rooted in Eretz Yisrael, both Abaya and Rava would agree that any vegetation, regardless of where it grows, would be subject to Chumas and Meiser. And this case, now Rabbi and Gamliel and the tree on the border is not a kasha on that. It's not a raya. It's just a separate case entirely. So moving back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah talked about writing a get on Mechubar Lakarka, and then there was a sefer of the Mishnah. The sefer said that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said you can't write a get on stuff that is easily forgeable. So whether it's Nair Hamachuk, parchment that was already erased, or on diphthera. And Rashi said the Gemara will explain what diphthera is, and that's what we're about to do. So in the tanning process, I learned yesterday, in the tanning process, there are a few stages. Right? First, you just have hide, and then you salt the hide. That's one step. And then you use flour to do something with the hide. And then after the flour, you apply gallnut water to the hide. And then you've got cloth. So there's a bit of a process. And throughout this process, there's different names given to the thing. And diphthera, as we're going to see, is one of the stages. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Gimel Oros Hand, like we just spoke of. There's three kind of stages in the tanning process. Matzah, Chayfa, the diphthera. So matzah, chayfa, and diphthera. Matzah, kamashmo. Matzah is like it sounds, right? We know matzah in the Pesach context it's nothing, right? It's flour and water. That's it. There's no ingredients mixed in. So it's delo maliach, udlo kamiach, udlo afetz. So matzah in the parchment context, in the tanning context, it's a hide that you haven't applied the salting process, you haven't done the flouring process, and you haven't applied the gallnut water. It's just hide right in the beginning. I should have said that this entire memra is being said in the context of Hilchos Shabbos. So that's why some of this is going to be a little Hilchos Shabbos related. So Lamai Hilchasa. So why do we care? We're going to talk about certain measurements. Why do we care how large this matzah parchment is? Shabbos, we need to know the correct shear to know when am I chayev if I do hotzah. So when you learn Hilchos Shabbos, when you learn Masechah Shabbos, so much of Masechah Shabbos is dominated by very technical discussions about the size of various things and the correct shear of different things for Hotzah Shabbos. So if I have it in my pocket and I walk in Rosh Hashanah, am I going to be chayev or not? It depends if I'm the shear of what I'm carrying, and the shear for everything is a little bit different. So the reason why I need to know what is a certain shear of this matzah parchment is to know if I'm chayev if I bring it out on Shabbos. So Kama Shiro, what is the shear to make me chayev on Shabbos? Keretani, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Kere Latzur Mishkal Katana. It's the size that's necessary to wrap a small weight. So in those days they used weights in the grocery store, like literal weights. Just know how heavy. So it's the smallest weight. It needs to be covered by some sort of cloth of some sort, matzah, and that's the proper shear. The kama, what is that shear? So Amar Abaya, like what is the smallest weight? The riva, the pumpadisa. So a certain weight had to be there, I guess, but it's the smallest weight that we used in pumpadisa. Okay, that was matzah. Chayfa, this is the next stage of the tanning process. Demaliach below kamiach below afetz. This was salted, but it wasn't floured, and you didn't apply the gallnut water. Again, Lamai Hilchasa, Lotzah Shabbos. Why do we need another shear for Lotzah Shabbos? For Kamashur, what's the shear of this one, of Chayfa, Kidisnan? We have a Mishnah, or Tilasos Kamil. It's the right shear to like cover up or protect amulet, which was, again, a big deal back in the day. Diphthera, that's why we're talking about this. Diphthera, Dimaliach, the Kamiach below Uffins. It is salted, it is floured, but you didn't apply the gallnut water, and that's why it's easily forageable. Because there's some quality in this gallnut water that makes it hard to forage. But if you haven't applied the gallnut water, it's still easily forageable. And that's this diphthera, Shabbos, the Kamashi Uro, and what is the size? This is clearly the Rabbanan in our Mishnah that said you are allowed to write a get on diphthera, and the correct size of what you'd be chayav for on Shabbos is the size of writing of a get. Rashi speaks out that there's obviously a fourth stage, which is you've done maliach, you've done the flowering, you've done the gallnut water. That's what's known as klaf. So this entire memra is dealing with before klaf. What we know as klaf, we've already applied the gallnut water, and that's like a finished product. But the bottom line is the Gemara says the Chachamim do allow you to use diphthera. Why? I mean, if it's easily forageable, why would the Chachamim allow you to use it? So man Chachamim, who are the Chachamim? Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rab Elazar, he's Rabbi Elazar, the Amora, Rabbi Elazar ben Hadas, says that the shita of our Mishnah, the Chachamim, who are paskening like Rabbi Elazar ben Shemuel, like Rabbi Elazar the Tana. So Amar Eidei Mesira Karti, he says that Eidei Mesira is Karti, right? This is a machlokas that has already come up all the time, will continue to come up all the time. Machlokas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar, in terms of the get, is it Eidei Chasima that's Karti, or Eidei Mesira? If you're Rabbi Elazar and you say Eidei Mesira Karti, we're not as concerned about what's written in the get, because what's really going to effectuate this divorce is the Eidim that see the Mesira. And as we saw, not yesterday, but the day before, the Eidim Mesira need to read the contents of the get. They're going to know what's in the get when the husband gave it to her. That's what they watched. And therefore, should she try to erase some clause, if she wants to get divorced, she's going to need to bring these Eidim Mesira into Beis Din. They're going to be able to say that clause wasn't there. We read the get recently, yesterday or whatever it was. We saw what was in there. So I'm not concerned about her forging the get, because the Eidim Mesira are going to be able to catch the forgery. And if you're wondering, what if she comes into Beis Din like 5 years later? How's anyone supposed to remember? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, and again, Rabbi Elazar the Amora saying, and lo hichshur Rabbi Elazar the Tana, ela la'alto. The only way this is going to work, you can only use diphthera if the woman gets it, goes right to Beis Din that day. The Eidim Mesira come with her. Beis Din basically says this is all good. They give her the right to remarry. And again, we're not concerned about her forging the get, because the Eidim Mesira need to come into Beis Din. They just read it this morning, so they're going to know if she played games, and therefore we're no longer concerned that she can forge the get, because again, we need Eidei Mesira. Rabbi Yochanan argues with Rabbi Elazar, and he says, I don't think you need to necessarily come into Beis Din that day. You can even wait a little bit. Because if there really was some sort of t'nai that was in the get that she didn't like, they would remember. And it sounds like, again, from Rashi, and it sounds like from the portion that gets, again, Reish would probably tell us for sure, they're very, very, very standardized. So to the extent there was some t'nai that was off, the Eidim would know. And now when they come to read the get, even if it's a few weeks later, they're going to remember, like, oh, I remember you. You were the one with the goofy t'nai. Is the goofy t'nai still in here, or is it not in here? Right? So if she tried to take it out, they would know about it. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, we're only going to get to the Mishnah, so a few more lines. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, again, Rabbi Elazar the Amora says, Lo hichshur Rabbi Elazar the Tana, ela begitin. This entire use of diphthera, of something that's easily forgeable, he only allowed by gittin, aval b'shtar shtaros lo, but not by other shtaros, because we have a pasuk, there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. So the context over there was they were about to be Galus Bavel, and Hashem and a Nevuah came to Yirmiyahu and he said, go buy certain property, but we're also going to Gullus. So make sure you've got a good star and make sure you can save the star for a very long time, for 7 years. So when you come back to Eretz Yisrael, a star, you can go to whoever the current owner is and you can say, this is my land. But the point is, from the fact that we see that he said, make sure your star is good for 70 years or so, that's mashma that when it comes to non-gittin, we need a star that can last 70 years. And again, Rebbe Lazar L'Shitaso says that when it comes to gittin, you can only use this diphthera if you're going to go into Bezdin that day. Clearly, for other staros that you're going to have to hang on to for a long time, you can't use diphthera, because the only way you can use diphthera is if you're going to come into Bezdin immediately. So we know that there wasn't a forgery. If you're going to tell me that you're going to have a star that's going to sit in your safe for years and years and years, then you cannot use diphthera. But Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afilu b'shtaros. He says, no, the same way I think you can use diphthera by a get, you can use diphthera by other shtaros. And again, Rabbi Yochanan L'Shitaso said, you don't necessarily need to come into Bezdin that day. You can even wait a long time. The Gemara says, what's he going to do with this pasuk? Clearly, even if you can use diphthera and you can bring the Edom a few weeks later, you can't expect to come years later and have the same Edom as Hira and expect them to remember. So what's this pasuk saying? So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, that's not a halacha. He's just saying, Hashem is telling that, Yirmiyah is telling whoever, bottom line, we're going to need this star and we're going to need to show it to people 7 years from now. So make sure you do it in a way that people are going to believe you. So he's just giving you good business advice. If you need a star that you're going to rely on years from now, do it in a way that you can maintain the star and it won't be easily forgeable. But that's not